The fire spreads. By 1781, the war's outcome hung in balance. Congress was broke. Soldiers went unpaid. Supplies vanished. Yet somehow, the idea of freedom kept them standing. In farmhouses and churches, people still read the Declaration of Independence aloud by candlelight. Those words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had become more than ink. They were the fire in the nation's heart. In France, Jefferson's document was studied by philosophers and dreamers. In Latin America, whispers of rebellion began. The world was watching the impossible, ordinary people defying kings and surviving. The out-trap at Yorktown. Then came the moment history would remember. October 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis had dug in with his army near the coast, confident his navy would protect him. But fate and France had other plans. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off British escape. Washington, marching from the north with Lafayette and French General Rochambeau, closed in from land. Night and day cannons thundered, the ground shook. American and French flags fluttered side by side in the smoke. At dawn on October 17th, white flags appeared over the British trenches. Cornwallis had surrendered. After 6 long years, the war was effectively over. The quiet after the storm. When news of victory reached Philadelphia, church bells rang as they had on that first July 4th. People filled the streets, shouting, laughing, crying. But in Washington's camp, there was no celebration, only silence. He walked alone among his soldiers, many of them barefoot still, and said quietly, "The war is over. The price has been paid." He would later write, "We have overcome by perseverance and fortitude, and may the same spirit be transmitted to our children." A nation reflects. In 1783, Britain finally recognized the independence of the United States. The dream had become real. But what had begun as an act of rebellion was now something deeper, an experiment in human freedom. The ideals of Jefferson's Declaration would haunt and inspire generations to come. Would all men truly be treated as equals? Would liberty extend to the enslaved, the poor, the voiceless? The revolution had ended, but the work of freedom had only begun. The echo of words. Years later, an aging Thomas Jefferson sat in his study at Monticello, the mountains glowing red in the sunset. He held the old parchment in his hands, its ink faded, edges brittle. He whispered to himself, "We started a fire. May it never be extinguished." Outside, in the distance, a child recited from memory, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And across time, through wars, revolutions, and generations, those words continued to echo, reminding the world that the story of freedom had been written not by kings, but by ordinary men with extraordinary courage. The dream tested. The war had ended, but peace did not come easily. When the smoke cleared from Yorktown and the British sailed away, the 13 colonies stood in silence, free but fragile. They had no king, no clear government, no money, only a dream and a piece of paper that began with the words, "We the people." But even that dream would soon be tested. The fractured republic. Philadelphia again, the year 1787. Inside the same hall where independence had been declared, the air was thick with arguments once more. The revolution's leaders had returned, older, worn by war, but still fiery. George Washington sat at the head of the room, silent as a mountain. He'd been persuaded out of retirement to preside over the Constitutional Convention. Around him, men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin debated the soul of the new nation. Should power rest in the states or the central government? How could they balance liberty with order? Franklin, now 81 and frail, leaned forward one day and said quietly, "When you assemble men to benefit the public good, you must expect that some will seek their own." The delegates nodded. They knew he was right. America's greatest battle was no longer against redcoats. It was against itself. The birth of the Constitution. For 4 sweltering months, the debates raged. Doors were locked, curtains drawn. The city outside buzzed with rumors. What were they building in there? Inside, compromise became the hammer that forged unity. The Great Compromise balanced big states and small ones. The 3/5 Compromise, a dark and tragic shadow, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. When the Constitution was finally signed, Franklin looked up at the carving of a sun on the back of Washington's chair. He said, "I have often looked at that sun and wondered whether it was rising or setting, but now I know it is a rising sun." The United States of America was reborn, this time not through revolution, but through reason. The first president. In 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. The crowd gathered at Federal Hall in New York, cheering as he placed his hand on the Bible. He spoke softly. "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is entrusted to the hands of the American people." There were no royal trumpets, no golden crowns, only the quiet dignity of a man who knew that power must serve, not rule. In that moment, the experiment of self-government began. The storm of politics. But even Washington could not stop the storm of division. Alexander Hamilton, brilliant, impatient, ambitious, pushed for a strong federal government and a national bank. Thomas Jefferson, philosophical, wary, idealistic, fought for states' rights and agrarian democracy. Their rivalry split the young nation into factions, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Washington watched the arguments unfold, his heart heavy. "The spirit of party," he warned, "is the worst enemy of government." He stepped down after 2 terms, setting an example that would echo through history. No president is a king. The torch passed. When Washington retired to Mount Vernon, the country he helped create stood on shaky ground, but burning with promise. He died 2 years later, in 1799, and across the land, church bells tolled for a week. In France, Napoleon reportedly paused and said, "Washington is dead, but his example lives forever." And it did. But the question remained, could the ideals of the Declaration survive the reality of politics? Jefferson's America began to unfold when Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the words that started it all, became the nation's 3rd president in 1801. In his inaugural address, he spoke directly to a divided people. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." Under his leadership, the United States doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase, stretching from the Mississippi to the Rockies. He sent Lewis and Clark to explore the uncharted West, to map rivers, mountains, and the promise of a new world. every step westward was a continuation of the dream, the pursuit of happiness, spreading under open skies. Yet Jefferson, too, carried contradictions. He owned slaves even as he wrote that all men were created equal. The nation's ideals shone bright, but its shadows grew darker. The question of freedom. As the 19th century began, the contradiction at America's heart became impossible to ignore. In the North, industry was rising. In the South, slavery's chains grew tighter. The same nation that had fought for liberty was denying it to millions. A young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, reading Jefferson's words decades later, would call them a promise made to all men. But that promise was far from fulfilled. The founding generation had won independence, but they had not yet secured equality. The world watches. Meanwhile, across the oceans, Jefferson's declaration continued to ignite change. In France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man echoed his words. In Latin America, Simón Bolívar invoked them to rally independence movements. Even in Asia and Africa, the idea began to spread that people could govern themselves, not be ruled. Jefferson once said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." He had not imagined how prophetic that would be. By the time Jefferson and Adams both died, remarkably on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration, America was unrecognizable from the fragile nation they had helped create. Steamships churned down the rivers, cities rose, immigrants poured in. Yet every July 4th, the bells still rang. Children still memorized the words that had once risked everything. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The founders were gone, but their words had become the nation's heartbeat. The dream endures. In the twilight of his life, Jefferson wrote a final letter to a friend. "All eyes are opened, or opening, to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind was not born with saddles on their backs." Those words were not meant only for his time, but for every generation that would inherit the dream. Because the Declaration was never finished, it was a promise, one that would have to be renewed again and again by those willing to believe that freedom was not a gift, but a duty. The revolution had built a nation. The nation would now have to build itself. The fire rekindled. The century had turned. The United States of America stretched from ocean to ocean, a land of ambition and contradictions. In the streets of New York, factories roared and ships crowded the harbors. In the cotton fields of the South, enslaved men and women toiled from dawn till dusk under a sun that gave them no mercy. The country that had been founded on freedom was now divided by chains. And the question that had haunted Jefferson's words for 80 years was finally demanding an answer. The century had turned. The United States of America stretched from ocean to ocean, a land of ambition and contradictions. In the streets of New York, factories roared and ships crowded the harbors. In the cotton fields of the South, enslaved men and women toiled from dawn till dusk under a sun that gave them no mercy. The country that had been founded on freedom was now divided by chains. And the question that had haunted Jefferson's words for 80 years was finally demanding an answer. The nation splits. In 1860, a tall, solemn lawyer from Illinois won the presidency, Abraham Lincoln. He had risen from poverty, taught himself law, and believed deeply in the promise of Jefferson's words. In his debates, he had said plainly,
A house divided against itself cannot stand. The South saw his election as a threat. Within months, 11 states seceded from the Union, declaring themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America. And in April 1861, cannons roared at Fort Sumter. The war for the soul. For 4 years, America tore itself apart. The blue and the gray met in fields and forests from Gettysburg to Shiloh, from Antietam to Atlanta. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers buried sons. Smoke rolled across the land like a storm that would never end. Through it all, Lincoln carried the Declaration in his heart. To him, the war was not just about saving the Union, it was about redeeming its founding promise. This nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Those words spoken later at Gettysburg echoed Jefferson's declaration across a century of struggle. The Emancipation. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. His hand trembled as he wrote his name, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Years later, he said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." With a stroke of ink, he transformed the war from a battle for union into a crusade for human freedom. News spread slowly, but when enslaved men and women heard, they fell to their knees and wept. In those moments, the words Jefferson had written in candlelight became flesh and blood. All men are created equal. At last, those words began to mean what they had always promised. Gettysburg, July 1863. A small Pennsylvania town became the site of the war's greatest battle. For 3 days, fire and thunder consumed the hills. When it ended, 50,000 men were dead or wounded, a sacrifice beyond measure. Months later, Lincoln arrived to dedicate the cemetery. He stood before the graves and spoke for barely 2 minutes. Yet his words would outlive centuries. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The crowd stood in silence. Some wept. In those 272 words, the spirit of the Declaration had been reborn, not in ink, but in blood and tears. The end of the war. April 1865. The Confederate capital of Richmond fell. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. That night, as Lincoln walked through the streets of Washington, freed men and women surrounded him, crying and singing. One man fell to his knees before the president. Lincoln gently took his hand and said, "Do not kneel to me. You must kneel only to God and thank Him for the freedom you now enjoy." The crowd erupted in joy. For the first time, America felt whole. But history's cruelest twist was yet to come.
The shot that shook the world. April 14th, 1865, 5 days after victory. Lincoln and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Laughter filled the room. The war was over. The country was healing. Then, a gunshot. The assassin's bullet struck the back of Lincoln's head. He died the next morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood by his bed and whispered through tears, "Now he belongs to the ages." Across the nation, bells tolled once again, not for war, but for the man who had saved the Union and given life to its promise. Jefferson had written the words. Lincoln had made them real. The rebirth. The years that followed were called Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th promised citizenship and voting rights to all men. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the dream of the Declaration had finally come true. But old hatred dies hard. Violence and racism rose from the ashes of the war, testing once again the meaning of equality. The nation had been reborn, but not yet healed. The echo through time. Still, the spirit of 1776 lived on. Every time an immigrant arrived at Ellis Island, every time a woman demanded the right to vote, every time a voice cried out against injustice, the echo of Jefferson's pen and Lincoln's words answered back. The Declaration of Independence had become more than a document. It was a mirror, reflecting what America was and what it still could be. The promised endures. Years later, Frederick Douglass would say, "The principles contained in the Declaration of Independence are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes." And so the story continued, not finished, but ongoing. From the fields of Valley Forge to the blood-soaked hills of Gettysburg, from Jefferson's candle to Lincoln's hand, the same fire burned: freedom. The Declaration had been tested in war and redeemed in sacrifice. It had survived betrayal, division, and death. And though the men who wrote and fought for it were gone, their words remained, alive, waiting, challenging every generation to rise to their promise. The revolution was reborn, the dream endured, and the fire still burns. The long shadow of freedom. The ink of 1776 had long since faded, but its words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," refused to die. They lived through centuries of struggle, whispered through wars, protests, and dreams. Every generation would be forced to decide what those words meant and who they truly included. The new century. The 1900s arrived like a thunderclap. Factories roared, cities rose, and immigrants from across the world poured into America, chasing the promise of freedom. The Statue of Liberty stood in New York Harbor, a woman of bronze holding a torch against the sky. To millions arriving from Europe, her light was the first sign of a new life. But that promise wasn't yet equal for all. African Americans in the South faced segregation and terror under Jim Crow laws. Native Americans were forced onto reservations. Women still could not vote. The dream of liberty burned bright, but its light fell unevenly across the land. The fight for rights. The early 20th century became an era of awakening. In factories, workers organized for fair wages. In the streets, suffragists marched for the right to vote. In 1920, after decades of protest, the 19th Amendment was ratified. For the first time in U.S. history, women could cast their ballots, another step toward the equality the Declaration had promised. Across the nation, banners read, "Equality for all, not for some." The torch of liberty was passed once again, this time to women whose voices had been silent for too long. The world at war. Then came 2 world wars. When America entered World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt told the nation, "We look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms." Once again, America found itself defending the same ideals Jefferson had written nearly 2 centuries earlier, not just for itself, but for all humanity. Yet even as soldiers fought fascism abroad, segregation persisted at home. African American troops returned from war demanding the freedom they had fought to protect. A new revolution was stirring, not with muskets, but with marches. The dream reborn.
The 1950s and 1960s lit the fuse of the civil rights movement. In Montgomery, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. In Washington, a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a crowd of 250,000 people. His words reached beyond the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and straight into the soul of the Declaration itself. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The same words written in 1776, now reborn in 1963, became a rallying cry for a new America. A nation tested again. The struggle didn't end there. The Vietnam War divided generations. Assassinations shook the nation. Kennedy, Malcolm X, King, each loss felt like a crack in the promise of freedom. But the people, the students, the activists, the dreamers, refused to let the dream die. Protests filled the streets. Art and music carried messages of change, and the Constitution bent once again toward justice. Bit by bit, the meaning of "we the people" expanded to include those once forgotten, ignored, or silenced.
The modern age. As the decades turned, new movements rose for gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, immigration reform, and climate justice. The same question echoed through them all. What does freedom mean? And who is it for? The internet connected the world. Voices once small became loud, and truth itself became a battleground. Yet through every storm, the same ideals endured, imperfect, unfinished, but unbroken. The fire still burns. Today, the parchment that Jefferson and his fellow revolutionaries signed lies preserved in glass at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Visitors lean close, peering through the dim light at the faded signatures. Adams, Franklin, Jefferson. Around that fragile paper, silence falls. It is not just a relic. It is a mirror, reflecting every triumph and every failure of a nation forever trying to live up to its own words. Each generation adds its own verse to the unfinished song of freedom. The eternal promise. Imagine a night much like that of July 4th, 1776. Stars overhead, a candle burning low, a handful of people daring to believe they could build something the world had never seen. A government by the people, for the people. They knew the risks. They knew it might fail. But they also knew that ideas, once set free, cannot be caged. That night they didn't just found a nation, they lit a fire. And across centuries, that fire still burns, in the voices of protest, in the hands that vote, in the hearts that dream. Freedom, after all, is not a gift, it's a responsibility. The story lives on. From Jefferson's quill to Lincoln's courage, from suffragists' footsteps to King's dream. America's story is the story of an idea that refuses to die. An idea written in ink, tested in blood, and renewed in every generation. All men and women are created equal. And as long as someone, somewhere believes in those words, the story of America will never end.